Dear friends, welcome to the IIRP conference inviting collective energy igniting social change. My name is Claire de Mezerville Lopez. It is my honor to introduce this opening session. I celebrate us being together in this restorative journey. And before we begin, I just would like to go through some housekeeping points. I would really like to encourage you to participate actively in the chat. We're excited to hear your name. Where are you joining us from? What brought you here? When you chat, please be sure to select all panelists and attendees. Remember that closed captioning is available for this session if you choose to select it. We really hope that you enjoy this session. And it is a great joy to be here together. There is so much to share in this conference. You are able to navigate through the attendee hub, look at the richness of material that is to be found there. And there are so many exciting things going to happen from today until Friday. I would like to thank our friend and colleague, Ben Wachtel, who is supporting us with all the technical things that need to happen during this session. Ben, will you please activate a poll that we prepared for all of us? So let's start with this poll. What are you most looking forward in this conference? So take a look, and you may select not only one option, you may select a couple. We have panels that are going to focus on environmental justice, how restorative collective energy is necessary for that. We're going to have panels about reimagining education, about how to create collaboration in the workplace. We have an exhibit hall where a lot of communities and organizations from that do work in restorative justice and restorative practices and other fields are creating change. We have a range of research posters in the topics of restorative justice, restorative practices, and collective cooperation. We have interactive sessions. We have art sessions where we're going to share poetry, stories, some visual art. So you see, we have a lot of things that are going to take place in these couple of days. So let me just offer a couple more seconds so you respond to the poll. And we're going to end the poll in just a couple of moments. Okay, Ben, how about we end the poll and we share with our friends what our responses were? So we're very excited about reimagining education. Look at that. Isn't that something? We're very excited about our workplace panels and environmental justice panels. I really hope you take some time to visit our exhibit hall at the attendee hub and to participate and engage in the interactive sessions. This is not a conference just to listen. It's a conference to learn from one another and to share. We're going to have a couple of art and expression sessions that are going to be really exciting, and small group conversations. Small group is the unit of change, someone said, and we're going to talk about that too. So thank you so much, Ben. This conference is possible thanks and because of all of you. And also thank you to our friends that are sponsoring this event. So I would like to thank our conference sponsor, Open Society Foundations. On a global scale, Open Society Foundations works with more than 120 countries to shape public policy that promotes democratic governance, human rights, and economic, legal, and social reform. The organization has been instrumental in furthering restorative practices in local schools and communities. And to learn a little bit more from them, Ben, can we share a video to take a look at Open Society Foundations?
Open Society Institute has been working with IIRP and other partners for many years to create a healing and restorative Baltimore City. Our RP journey began with Baltimore City Public Schools. A one-year RP intensive pilot with 15 schools showed a whopping 44% decrease in out-of-school suspensions. Teachers also reported substantial improvements in school climate and relationships overall. Please see our RP materials for your use on the conference website.
So before we begin, I would like to take a moment to share an invitation with all of us. We are together here through technology, and at the same time, We are a group held by a diversity of lands and territories. So I would like to invite you, if you wish to do so, to acknowledge your land in the chat and think about each of our personal connections to the place that we call home. I call Costa Rica my home. Before it was named Costa Rica, it was already the home of 8 peoples: the Wetar, Maleku, Bribri, Cabécar, Brunca, Ngabe, Broran, and the Chorotegas. I would humbly like to invite all of us to show respect for all indigenous lands across the globe and to honor our collective responsibility to care for the land people call home. We have learned that the restorative questions go from the past to the present to the future. May this conference help us to acknowledge the harm, injustice, and violence in the roots from our pasts, and the honor that all caretakers of the land deserve. May our present kindle our collective commitment to be diligent caretakers, to care for our planet and all of its peoples, to act, to repair, and to connect. May we envision together a future for the lands that our children's children will share and call home, with a deeper commitment so that we as humans are able to do better, be better, and share dignity and joy. And speaking of joy, I am so glad and grateful to the wonderful keynote speaker that is joining us today. I will ask my friend, my colleague and mentor, Pat Lewis, our director from IIRP Canada, to introduce her. Pat.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, everyone. I'm honored to introduce you all to our speaker this morning. Nobel Prize nominee Sheila Watt-Coultier is in the business of transforming public opinion into public policy. Experienced in working with global decision makers for over a decade, she offers all of us a new model for 21st century leadership. Sheila served as the elected Canadian president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council for 7 years before being elected as the council's international chair, a position that she held until 2006. In 2007, she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for her advocacy work in showing the impact of global climate change on human rights, especially in the Arctic, where it is felt more immediately and more dramatically than anywhere else in the world. Sheila explores this in her best-selling memoir, The Right to be Cold, one woman's story of protecting her culture, the Arctic, and the whole planet. In addition, Sheila is an officer of the Order of Canada and the recipient of many awards, including the Aboriginal Achievement Award, the UN Champion of the Earth Award, the Norwegian Sophie Prize, and the Right Livelihood Award, which is widely considered the Nobel alternative. Please join me in warmly welcoming Sheila Watt-Coultier to our session this morning. Sheila?
Nakomi Marialo Kilunasi. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I start with my mother tongue, Inuktitut. I would normally be in the Arctic speaking to you, where I have my little home in Kudra, but because of COVID and the pandemic, all virtual events started to happen, and then the internet interfered with that in the north because it's very weak up there. So I've had to move to Montreal to be able to do what I continue to do in my life's work, is to connect to those around the world, to share the Inuit story, the Arctic story, and how all that connects to each and every one of us, no matter where we are on this planet Earth of ours. So it's a real pleasure and a real honor, and thank you to everyone who has made this happen this morning. I had told the organizers I've got a bit of a cold, so bear with me. I've got a little bit of a lozenge going on here, but I will certainly attempt to convey the human messaging that I do around the issues of environmental degradation and climate change and humanize these issues. But I want to start with and I come from Coudray, which is a northern part of Nunavik, which is a northern part of Quebec. And that's where I was born and raised until I was sent away at the age of 10 for school. And then I was raised by strangers and in residential school for 3 years as well, for a total of 8 years away from home. But that's where I would normally be speaking to all of you. I want to start by a quote that is actually the epigraph of my book, The Right to Be Cold, which has stayed with me for many, many years. And I always kept it framed in front of me on my desk. And I just want to start with that quote from a woman poet from the United States. And she's long gone, but I did get permission to use it for my book, where she says, "In a time lacking in truth and certainty and filled with anguish and despair, no woman should be shamefaced in attempting to give back to the world through her work a portion of its lost heart." And that's the work that I have always resonated and connected with in that sense. So teaching these issues of the Arctic and the North, where most people have not come to understand the people of the North, and the world has come to understand and know better the wildlife of the Arctic rather than its people. And so it's really important for me to share with you that there are people who live there and who love to live there. And it's not an inhospitable place, that indeed it is a warm and welcoming place with people who would really welcome those who come to visit us. I want to walk you through, before I get into local to global and all of these issues that really connect all of us today, to walk you through the historical context, because I think it's really important for people to understand that context if we are going to move beyond the misunderstandings of our world today between Indigenous peoples and the wider world that really don't understand the historical context of why, especially us in the Arctic, where we are dealing with the highest suicide rates in North America of our young people that we are losing so quickly. And this has been happening for quite some time, and we're still trying to get a handle on this whole situation. But I want to walk you through these historical traumas that very few people know about, as to why we struggle so hard on the social and health issues in the Arctic. In the 1920s, we were made to become fur trappers. You know, we would trap certain fox furs and so on for our clothing, but certainly not to become a marketable commodity for the world. We were becoming fur traders to meet the global market for fur in the 1920s. And that really started to shift the way in which our lives were being impacted globally. And that was the beginning of the shift of the way of life that we had very traditionally still on the land. Our spiritual practices started to be destroyed by religion, and our cultural practices as well. And that was happening very, very quickly. And then we started to barter for food and flour and lard and sugar and tea and all of the things that we were not accustomed to. And our food diet started to change almost overnight during that time, when the Hudson's Bay Company and other trading companies came up into the Arctic. And when the global collapse occurred of the fur market, it created a lot of starvation for us in our Inuit world, because we were all but forgotten when the fur market collapsed, and everybody else forgot about us because we weren't needed anymore. Until the American military arrived to build airstrips during the Second World War. Now, they didn't come on a mission to save us from the famine and the starvation as a result of the collapse of the fur market, but they came to build airstrips that they would land in our area and go all the way over to Europe during the Second World War. But with that, they brought jobs, they brought supplies, they brought food, and saved a lot of people from further starvation. And so we have this soft spot in our hearts for the Americans as a result of that incredible history that happened during that period of time. The schools that were built, we were forced into communities back in the 1950s. Things started to really shift, where we were being brought out from the land, where we were still living very traditionally in the 1950s. and schools were being built. And so there was less hunting on the land, and the land being our natural teacher was replaced by institutional schooling. And that was yet another start of creating more dependencies and diminishing our ability to think and to act for ourselves. And there were more processed foods coming into play because the Hudson's Bay Company stores were opening up. And there were more heated homes that we were put into rather than our igluviaks, which is the stone houses that we lived in. And our men still can make those superbly. And I'll mention that later. So we were moved into these small matchbox houses, and I remember living in them. All six of us were in these little homes with heated homes, but no running water. And that started to create even more health problems. In the 1960s, there were a lot more historical traumas that were happening. The residential schools that were set up, we were sent away. As I say, I was sent away very young at the age of 10. We were forced, many families were forced into the very high Arctic in the name of sovereignty. And they're still living the legacy of those kinds of traumas that they went through when they were forced up there, not able to come back to their communities, which were in the lower parts of the Arctic, in Nunavik, where I was born. The dog slaughters, the 20,000 dog slaughters that happened during that period of time, was devastating for our hunters in the name of in the name of health, they said, and safety, but actually it was to coerce us into the communities that were being developed and being new infrastructure and new systems were being put in. The seal ban is by the misguided emotional stances of the animal rights movements was really devastating for us. Because in the broad stroke of being anti-sealing with the commercial sealers, we're not commercial sealers, but with that broad stroke, we were able to make, 18,000 to a year, which was a lot of money in the 60s for our hunters who were transitioning to feed their families with the byproduct of the seal of our subsistence hunt. And we were able to make a living in those days, enough to feed our families. And the animal rights movements just took all that away with their broad stroke against anti-sealing. And so our men went from making $18,000 a year to zero overnight. And that was the start of dependencies once again to welfare systems and so on. And then there was a lot of judgments that were happening as well, with the blood on the ice. When people see blood on we're seal hunters, we're marine mammal hunters. When we see blood on the ice, we're celebrating because we're going to eat. But yet it becomes a judgment issue from the outside world on the sealing and the marine mammal hunting that we do. And I often say that, it's really not a confirmation of death for us when we see that and have that happen. It's really an affirmation of life. It's life-giving life. And it's very much like your hands in the dirt in your gardens is the same source as our hands in the blood of the harvest that we have. And so to try to understand these connections together is important, because we can't be thinking that these are all separate issues. They're not. So your gardening and harvesting with your hands dirty in the dirt is the same as our hands in the blood of our harvest. It's all from source. And so there was authorities that were coming in that were starting to abuse the children in our communities. And you hear about that often, the sexual abuse that was starting to happen in those days, the substance and addictions that really set in during that period of time. In the 1970s, we started to negotiate land claims treaties with our governments because we became very savvy about our land and protecting it and try to maintain that. But at the same time, we relinquished a lot of our own rights because we categorized our lands in many ways. In the 1980s, toxins, we realized toxins were coming into our food chain and into the nursing milk of our mothers in higher levels than anywhere else. We became the net recipients of toxins, and these toxins are the byproduct of industry, and they come up through the weather patterns, and end up in the Arctic sink in the water, and we ingest the marine mammals that were ingesting these toxins, And it became an issue of urgent matter of health, first and foremost, where we became very engaged with at the UN level later on with the science that we had built up for 10 years with Health Canada and other institutes and our own committees, where we had to think about this in terms of a human health issue and an urgent matter to deal with. And we became heavily engaged at the UN negotiations that led to the successful Stockholm Convention that in those days eliminated the dirty dozen, what we called, and there's been more added to that. But imagine a world that we'd created when Inuit women had to think twice about nursing their babies as a result of toxins ending up in our food chain from very far away. And imagine that it was African women who were using some of these DDTs and toxins to protect their babies from dying from malaria. And so you can imagine the world that we created when women of the world had to carry the brunt of all of these issues. And so we had to do better, and we did better. And the world came to an understanding and eliminated many of these toxins, and they still continue to add new ones because we can't be dancing in the streets yet. We are still dealing with these toxins that end up in our polar bears. And then in the 90s, the unchecked climate change issues, now adding to an already very stressed communities of poverty that have been created due to all of these historical traumas and the dependencies that started to occur and the addictions and the challenges of poor health, the food insecurities, the addictions, the violence, the suicides. And as we started to recognize what was happening in our world, you know, we had to put a handle on all of these issues because for us, you see, our culture is so important to us. That ice that you talk about and you see in the news that is melting is our life force. It is our transportation. It is the way in which we travel to harvest the nutritious food that we eat. And our wildlife certainly thrives on that cold and that ice as well. The permafrost is melting very quickly. The coast is eroding very quickly. There are new species coming into play. The ice is forming very differently in the fall and very much later. This year, probably even one of the worst, where our rivers and the waters are freezing very slowly this year because it's not as cold as it needs to be. And so for us, it's about mobility and transportation as we travel the icy highways to get to our organic food that we harvest and hunt. And so when that starts to go and become precarious, it becomes an issue of safety and security first and foremost. And so for us, that's why for us, we have considered it as a human rights issue so that we can continue to be Inuit as we know it and travel those icy highways safely and keep that ice intact. So as we go into those spaces, though, of trying to understand what happened to our world where we were so highly independent with our own judicial, educational, health, social systems in place where we knew what our roles were. We were in a healthy state, not that we weren't having challenges. Of course you have, because we're in a very incredibly challenging environment, one of the most, inhospitable, what people consider inhospitable environments in the world. But we survived. Not only do we survive, we thrive in it. We understand it, and we give the training to our children in powerful ways, and I will get to that in a moment. But as we were learning about how these new systems that came into play to try to address the escalating health and social problems started to make things worse because they weren't addressing the root cause of our problems as being trauma-rooted causes, and that were really not addressed in these new systems and new education systems and new addictions programs and so on that weren't addressing the real cause of our problems. It's not because we're weak or have the inability to adapt to this new modern world. No, we are probably the most adaptable people in the world in terms of the surroundings that we live in the cold and the ice, that we've had to be very adaptable. So it isn't about that at all. And so as more and more of these institutions that were built to address the problems were built, we realized that, they were dependency producing. They were adding to the dependencies. And when you lose freedom and you become dependent on other things, then you lose that sense of your center and your wisdom to be able to address the issues that you need to do, the real traditional culture ways that were stripped from us by oppression and suppression. And now we're trying to gain that back and say, no, we need to get back where we were, who we are, and whatever was stripped, we've got to reclaim that. And so these dependency producing institutions often really just added to the problems and they didn't alleviate them. So what we're trying to develop now in the programs that we have is dependency liberating programs and initiatives to get our people back on their feet. And so we have to understand these pieces of freedom, people who have lost their freedom in that way. That has to be built up, human capacity, the human resourcefulness, all of those have to be back. And so how do we do that? Well, the answers don't lie very far from our home. In fact, the answers lie in our culture. The culture is our solution. Culture is our medicine, we are finding. And that is so important to us. And it is more important, I think, than what any other institutions can give. And of course, there's going to be a balance of how do we do that using the institutions and rebuilding back those institutions based on the values and principles of our world, of our culture. And our culture is our medicine. And I think that what the world is seeking today is in terms of trying to address sustainability, the answer is not far off either. I think that Indigenous wisdom is the medicine the world seeks in terms of trying to balance that sustainable world that we're seeking. And so I have been working quite a lot with foundations and how they can change the way in which they disperse their monies that were of course, built upon the resources of Indigenous lands over the many decades, if not, sorry. I'm sorry about that. And so we've got to think in those terms of how we're going to end up trying to address these issues in that way. And of course, things will happen rather slowly, but they will happen at the speed of empathy, and they will happen at the speed of trust. Meaning the more people get to understand our issues and our challenges from a place of full understanding and empathy, then that will speed up that process of building trusting relationships. So yes, speed of empathy and speed of trust is what needs to happen for all of these to come to a place where we can reconcile the histories of Indigenous peoples, not just in the Arctic, but in the world itself. And so the Inuit holistic way of teaching, and I say Inuit because that's through the lens that I tell my stories and give my talks, but Indigenous peoples alike are very much grounded with commonalities. And so the holistic way of teaching our children for the realities, yes, of a hunting culture, taught not only the technical skills to become a proficient provider and a natural conservationist, but they also taught the character building skills and life skills, such as patience and endurance and courage and boldness and persistence and focus, determination. And it built resiliency and coping skills and ultimately sound judgment and wisdom and how not to be impulsive is really important. And we're finding suicide is a very impulsive act. But if you've been taught traditionally, naturally, by culture and the land, that you have this built-in capacity that if you are impulsive around you on that land, you are putting yourself and others at risk. And of course, what happens is that you don't have that integrated, you're going to be very impulsive when the modern stressors come your way. And it's not just one solution here I'm talking about, but is an example of the character building and the character skills traditionally that are so important to maintain in Inuit culture and Indigenous culture. And so this holistic way in which we taught our children to be prepared for whatever is happening in their world around them, the character building, was replaced by irrelevant curriculum, which not only undermined our culture, and language, but it certainly didn't prepare us for the traumas to come. I want to spend a few minutes yet before I get into some of the more international work that I have been involved in, and the way forward, as I say, reimagining the new way forward with intention is really an important time in history now because of the pandemic and because of the recovery of the children that has opened up the minds and hearts of more of us and changed many of our perspectives in these places with the pandemic that really needs to be addressed more so today in our world that we live in. But country food, I want to address. You say, well, what's the importance of country food? What does that have to do with the pandemic? Or what does that have to do with economies or how, as we move forward? Well, I would say it has a lot to do with it. Country food is not just nutritional value for us. It's about the building of people and in terms of the emotional, the spiritual, the cultural value, pardon me, and the educational value is really important. As I mentioned to you, the character building skills that are so, so important. The emotional value, which is the connection to identity. It's very grounding, and the natural euphoria when we eat together, the connection to our family, the connection to the hunter, the connection to our ancestry. The spiritual value, women in silence, almost in a meditative state as they prepare the skins or prepare and butcher the food and prepare and sew the clothing that will keep us warm. The men who are in a yogic position, almost like on the ice, looking over the small hole where the seal will surface for many hours, call it their peaceful place. This is their meditative state. And this is what we need in a world that's becoming very chaotic for us, where we're dealing with states of emergencies over and over and over at so many levels in our Indigenous world. And so, the way in which we can connect to the animals. And as I say, as I cleaned I lost many family members during this international work I was doing, very close members of my family, my only sister, my mother, and my aunt and others. And I would be cleaning our animals, plucking the goose or the ptarmigans, my hands would be in blood, and I would grieve. And that's what I mean by that sense of connection to source. And that was really an important piece here with our animals, where we are just so connected to our country food. The communal value, eating from the same animal, is a powerful way in which we also bond. And the ceremonies and rituals that happen with the first hunt of our young men and our young women, as we celebrate that, it develops and creates more of that sense of grounding for them and the sense of building their self-worth as providers for the community. And so the medicinal value as well. I have a 10-year-old autistic grandson on the spectrum, and medicine, food is medicine for him, especially protein, especially country food. And this is what we're finding is all of these issues are about the human story of health for us. It's not just food that we buy in a cellophane wrapped and never know where that comes from. This is who we are. And that's where most Indigenous peoples also are from, in that space and place of being connected to their country food, their hunting, their way of living, and how it teaches those character building skills. And so humanizing the issues of these toxins and climate change, where the world knows more about our wildlife than its people, has been an important part of my work. And I have been doing this now for 27 years. And to think that is only now that some people are starting to really grasp the urgency of this matter of climate change and what we have been doing to our planet for so very long, that it isn't just about, even though it's important, it isn't just about the polar bears here in the Arctic or the ice, but bringing that human face, the human dimension, and the human rights dimension has been a really important piece of what I call my sacred work, to get the world to understand that it isn't just about politics, it isn't just about economics and science, even though those are all intertwined and interdependent and they're helpful, but it isn't just that anymore. We have been messaging this issue, I think, quite wrongly, that we need to think about our children and grandchildren, and that we can teach one another so much, and that we're in a great place of great opportunity now to reconnect to what really matters. If you haven't seen my TED Talk, please take a look at that, which I delivered in 2016, where I say human trauma and planet trauma are one of the same. And I say this very briefly, I'll just quote myself here. I say unsustainable waste causes irreparable damage to the atmosphere, and it's forcing the planet to react with violent storms and other erratic events. And this is not unlike the child, the Inuk child, the indigenous child, or any child who has gone through trauma without a space to heal. An effective coping mechanism, self-destructive behavior is inevitable. And what we see in our communities and in our atmosphere are not abnormal behaviors, and they're interlinked. What we see are perfectly normal reactions to extremely abnormal circumstances. So indeed, planet trauma and human trauma are one of the same. And we've got to start to reimagine a new way forward and re-engineer the way in which we do a lot of the work that we do in our institutions. And again, it's about reconciliation. The pandemic, is a grim reminder of how interconnected we all are. And we are certainly not set apart in the Arctic, we've known that for a long time now. And the pandemic has broken open, I think, even more widely, the unresolved issues of racism and social injustices, not just in Indigenous communities, but in the Black communities as well. And we can't be blaming one country. We can't be blaming one people for the virus, because it's really about what we've been doing to the habitat of all wildlife for decades upon decades now. And there will be more viruses as a result of what we're doing to the habitat of all wildlife on our planet. And so many countries have been fully exposed with their racist policies and approaches, which are putting even more at risk those who are already very vulnerable, living in poor health situations and health systems, such as we in the Arctic as well. So the pandemic has given us that time to pause, and I hope more and more people have reflected and started to change some of their approaches in how they do things, but because it's also given us a time for new possibilities and new perspectives. And as I said, in my work that I have been doing for 27 years, I knew that the planet was going to give in some way because of the inaction of our politicians to address these issues effectively. I never in my wildest dreams thought it would be a virus that would bring everything to a halt and make us reflect even more so on what we have been doing. And so when all of these unsustainable activities stopped, we also saw the pollution go down in many big cities. We saw animals surface where they have never surfaced before. And so it's not to suggest CO2s went down, because that will take a long, long time before that can happen. But we saw hope in some of that. And so I think we've got to know that climate change is also a big driver of these viruses, and that we need to try to understand better what is happening and what we could be doing to reimagine that new way forward with a conscious intention to really make shifts and changes in the way we do things in our lives, in the way in which we run our businesses. And so one of the things that really touched me one time when I was in New Zealand and Australia, I was on a panel with Tim Flannery, one of the greatest climatologists in the world. And as we were on a panel together, one of the audience members at the end of our panel discussion asked Tim, what is it about us in this world that is lacking, that is not allowing us to take urgent action to address climate change as urgently as we need to? And his answer was, what is lacking is imagination. And because the audience said, well, when there's so much science, to be truthful about this, that it's happening. And I would add, corroborated by the knowledge of Indigenous peoples who know what's happening on the ground, as they are the ground truthers of all of these changes that are happening. And so we have to start to reimagine, I think, and create a value shift in all that we do in the world today, not just within the Arctic economic development landscape, but also to reimagine and realign economic values with Indigenous values, which are based on fairness and respect for our land, our environment, our planet, and for each other, and go back to the basics much more. Because I think from a human community perspective, the human side of climate change humanizes the issue. And it's not just about wildlife, but for us and our children that we have to be thinking of. One of the things that I have been very much a big promoter of more recently, because our young leaders in Nunavut in particular started the movement of exploring conservation economies. And I think that's a real potential there. And and that was a few years ago when this started, where conservation economies, meaning with a culture match, that businesses that have a protective conservation intent is an incredible way to start to explore and go. And Nunavut in certain areas of Baffin Island and so on are starting to do that. And what better way if we can create that movement? And we have these big philanthropists now, Patagonia and Rockefeller and others are now starting to move in that direction with their deep pockets to support those who are going towards conservation economies. And so I've always believed that culture match economies, I think, or businesses is the way to go in that sense. And what I mean by that is people who better than Inuit themselves, who are already natural conservationists, to be there on the land, and ice being the guardians and the sentinels, and to be paid to do it. And how deeply affirming that would be to build back the ingenious knowledge, and that is so undervalued in our world. And what better way to reclaim what was taken from us, which is our sense of self-worth and our dignity and our resourcefulness and our wisdom. And I always say we are, after all, the inventors of the igluvigak. You call that the igloo. We can build homes of snow. I mean, warm enough for our mothers to birth in. This is ingenuity at its best. This is brilliance. And we have built the hayak. We are the inventors of the hayak. The hayak, which is the boat that is replicated worldwide. That is architecture, engineering at its very best. We can do this. And we don't need to be victims, and we don't want to be victims of globalization. We can be much more to this debate if we're included on so many levels. And we have lived states of emergencies for a long time now, for decades. And we have signaled to the world what is coming down the pipes when it comes to the climate change looming upon us. And sadly, not everyone listened. But now that I was busier than ever before COVID hit, because people were starting to make that connection and starting to live their own states of emergencies with the floods and the fires and the hurricanes and droughts that were now affecting their own livelihoods and their own homes, in fact, that they were losing, and their own lives that were being lost as a result of all of these states of emergencies that were occurring as a result of these traumas that our planet has been going through and showing up. And so here we are trying to make these connections and looking at ways in which we can rebuild back our communities. And I'm not suggesting that everything is all doom and gloom. That's not the point. The point is that we have much more to do on that front of environmental degradation and climate change. But our younger generation, some of them are really stepping up to the plate. And there's success stories every day now in our world where there's a certain generation, although we still have the highest suicide rates that are still happening, way too many big numbers. But we have younger generations too, in their 30s and 40s, that are really starting to pick up on filmmaking and jewelry making and performing arts and becoming the ambassadors for our world all over the world. The fashion design and the movies and one of our own in Greenland just got nominated a short story to the Oscars yesterday. And so, these are remarkable things that are starting to happen in our world, and we have to capitalize on that and really build back that kind of sense of confidence as we tell our stories in our own ways. And even the scientific world now has to also change the course in which how they do things. We have scientists who have come, and I've worked with many of them. I have a great deal of respect and regard for the work that they do. But very often, and although it's improving in terms of the guidelines, scientists would come in the spring and leave in the fall, like our geese, that migrate up. And we never would know fully what they were doing and how they were using that, what they were researching to help the communities that really needed that kind of feedback to know what was going on with the kind of research they did. But they too themselves have had to really, pardon me, I have a cold, so. But there was a time a couple of years ago when I was still living in my little place in Coudra, my hometown, before having to move to Montreal where internet is better. I was asked to be a keynote addresser for 1,200 scientists from 37 countries, which was a virtual event and hosted by Portugal. And I said, I have to make my mark with them as well. This is in the middle of the pandemic, and they too have to shift the way in which they transform personally about how they work with issues and people and the communities that they research so hard on. And I had come across a remarkable quote from an American scientist, an environmental lawyer, Gus Speth. Some of you, I'm sure, know of him. And I thought this would be a very fitting quote to share with these scientists, who have asked me to give them a keynote address. And as I was shifting the way in which I message because of the pandemic, that has deepened my resolve to humanize the issue of climate change. And this is what he said, and I used it in this work. This keynote. He said, I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, environmental collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems. But I was wrong, he said. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. And so I wondered how they would take this, and they lapped it up. They lapped it up because I think there's a shift in all of us around the world today, because the lessons that the pandemic is trying to teach us, that we've got to do things very differently. And we have to change our attitudes towards one another very differently. As Marianne Williamson says, it starts with us, the personal transformation. It really starts with us. And she says personal transformation can and does have global effects. As we go, so goes the world, for the world is us. And the revolution that will save the world is ultimately a personal one. And I truly believe that. And so going back to the work that I did before I end on leadership, I was living in Iqaluit, which is even further north up in Nunavut for almost 18 years or so. And while I was chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the G7, the finance ministers of the world, came to Iqaluit for the first time for their meetings. And that was in 2010. And we weren't part of the meetings, of course, because that's their high-level meetings, but we had side events and we had a media event. And as I was chair, I sent out a press release on some of my comments about how important the Arctic is to the planet and how important it is to address climate change. And that was way back in 2010. And this is a very short piece of what I said in the longer thing, just to give you an idea of what we're challenged with here in the Arctic. And I said in the press release, our future, the future of Inuit, is tied to the future to the rest of the planet. We are now part of the global economy, part of global society, and our home is a barometer for what is happening to our entire planet. If we cannot save the frozen Arctic, can we really hope to save the forests, the rivers, the farmlands, and other regions? A frozen Arctic allows us as Inuit to continue to choose our own future, to determine for ourselves how our economy and culture will develop. And a frozen Arctic also allows the same opportunity to the rest of the world instead of spending trillions of dollars simply to offset the impacts of a melting Arctic. And we know the impacts of what it's costing now is huge. Just a few months ago, we know what happened in Alaska. Alaska, where we Inuit live, is the hardest hit with climatic changes and coastal erosion of all the 4 countries that we Inuit live in, which is Alaska, Canada, Russia, and Greenland. And we saw what happened there in Alaska and the coastal erosion that happened, and the surge of the huge storm coming from the Bering Strait and what that did. And then just 2 weeks later in the Maritimes here in Canada, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, those areas, and the hard hit that happened to homes along the coast there. And then Florida right after that. And it just continues over and over and over. And we see, you know, what's happening in California. First the droughts and then the floods, and it's just happening. And it's been happening for a long time. So we've got to pay more attention to this in terms of how do we come together? How do we then reimagine that new world order? And how do we reimagine with a great deal of conscious intention to address these issues from a very human perspective, a human scale? And how do we treat Indigenous issues differently and Indigenous peoples, and bring out the wisdom that is so needed at this time to be able to balance a world that we still are so connected to in terms of the importance of protection, conserving, all of these things, that we're not just victims, that we can be teachers of sustainability if we are given that opportunity on an equal, equitable footing in that way and be heard. So I want to end now on the issue of leadership, not political leadership, but I was once asked while I was away teaching at Bowdoin College in the United States by Inuit women who were gathering in Iqaluit to have an Inuit Women's Summit on the importance of the priorities of what they see needed to be addressed in our world up in the Arctic, in that region. They said, we know you're away this year, but we would really like for you to be videotaped, and we'll bring you into our summit. We have a specific question for you. We'd like you to answer it, and then we would share it in our room as we gather, even though you're far away this year, but we want your voice in the room. And I said, I'd be happy to do that. And they said, the question to you is, what does leadership mean to you? And I thought long and hard about that. And there are other things that I have learned even recently on women leadership that really I think I will perhaps during the chats and so on, I can share. But this is what my take was at the time. And I would add a few more things to that today, is leadership to me means never to lose sight of the fact that the issues at hand are so much bigger than oneself. And leadership is about working from a principled and ethical place within oneself. It is to model authentically, genuinely for others a sense of calm, a sense of clarity, and a sense of focus. And leadership is to always check inwards to ensure one is leading from a position of strength, not fear or victimhood. So one does not project one's own limitations onto those you are modeling possibilities for. And so that is my take on leadership. And I think one of the things that I have discovered also much more recently is that there are ways in which we can deal with these issues without raging about it. And as Elizabeth Lesser, who had just written Cassandra Speaks, I would highly recommend that book, where she says, when women are the storytellers, the human story changes, where she says, the conscious leadership knows the difference between outrage and rage. And outrage is holy anger, triggering a strong emotional response, to the pain of others, but never dehumanizing others, and fills her sails to persuade, guide, and create. And rage is like a forest fire. It is impatient, vindictive, and short-sighted. And I'm not suggesting that women are the only ones who can lead us out of this, but because of our maternal instinct to protect, is a lot of movement going in that direction of putting issues in the forefront of that. And I commend the men who are doing in that same direction. So let's think about these issues of leadership and how we can move forward together and to build a common humanity that has those principles and values still intact. And let's learn from one another, from each other as women, as Indigenous peoples, and our common humanity, including all men, women, children, the younger generation. So thank you for this opportunity today to share some of my thoughts and hopes for us on this planet Earth of ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a great honor to have you and to listen to you. I feel grateful for you. I feel grateful for these keynotes, and I feel grateful for all this community that is joining here. I feel grateful that we are showing our full selves here in this session, in the chat. Thank you for that. We're not finishing yet. We're going to do something that is very dear to our hearts in IIRP, and it is that, as our friends from Design Learning say, the small group is the unit of change. So we would like to invite all of us to take some time to talk in small groups about the story we want to create together throughout these days and through our participation in the conference. So Kit, can you please help us to put this couple of questions in the chat? We're going to spend 10 minutes doing this. It's a small time. Groups are going to be of about 5 people. What would you like for this conference to be? And who do you want to be as a participant of this conference? And please feel free to also talk about Sheila's words. What has impacted you the most? What do you take with you? And then we'll come back after 10 minutes, have a little bit of a conversation with Sheila and among ourselves, and then just get this conference started. So Ben, will you please help us to create the rooms, and we'll meet you back here in about 10 minutes. It's going to be exciting to get to know some new people, and who knows, perhaps you get to be with someone that you know, but if you don't, it's going to be great to get to know some people that you don't know, and you'll be running into each other during these days. So we have in the chat the questions. We're going to broadcast them to the small groups as well. What has impacted you about Sheila's words? What would you like for this conference to be, and who do you want to be as a participant of this conference? So as soon as we have the breakouts ready, we're just click join small group as soon as it appears, and then we'll come back. A second while we're creating the groups, and we'll be back soon enough. And again, just acknowledging, I've been, as I listen, just learning from everything that you've been sharing in the chat. So this has been just a reminder of how we're learning from one another through this experience. So we're just going to create the rooms. Let me see. Okay. And then we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Are you getting a message to join the room? No? Well, these things happen when you start a virtual conference and you start having to play with features and technology. Okay, so Ben and I are trying to figure it out. as we figure it out, and we will, because, you know, we're very cool like that and very technical, and we try. But while we do that, while we figure it out, well, why don't we continue the conversation? I would like to, maybe we can use the Zoom raising hand so that I can see you and we can assign some order to the words, but I would love to listen to some of you. What do you take with you from what you have heard? What do you want this conference to be? Who do you want to be in this conference space? So Ben, just please let me know as soon as we get to fix this. Oh, they're working now. We'll see you back in 10 minutes. And then we'll talk about that.
One person started to dance in Central Park and everybody thought that that person was a little ridiculous. But once 2 or 3 other people started to join, and 4 and 5 and 6 started to join, it started a real movement. And I'm really having this this feeling of gratitude in my heart of how many of us are at this conference, and the possibilities that that can bring of bringing about change, because it's so obvious to me that the way how things are, it cannot continue like this. But to feel fellow hearts part of this journey is just very rewarding. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Someone else?
Hello, everyone. I came
Hi,
a little,
Michelle.
yes, I came a little late to the session, but I would just like to say it is always a privilege to be in a space where I could be listened to, and I can listen to other people and to learn about their experiences, and also to connect, because I think it's in our human nature to connect. And we don't usually have the opportunities because we're so busy with life. So it's always such a privilege to just be still and to be focused on something that is greater than ourselves. So it's my pleasure to be here. And I'm zooming in from Barbados, but I'm from Guyana, South America. So during this conference, I really want to continue growing, especially as a young woman, to see how these other professionals will impact my practice and my personal life, because I believe that that really shapes your practice. So in this conference, I hope to first start internally by just hearing and listening and taking notes, but then to also help others along as I share my journey. So.
Rochelle, it's so wonderful to have you. And before I hand it over to Shannon, just to remind you that Rochelle and Artie Mohan are going to be leading one of our interactive sessions tomorrow. So we're very much looking forward to that. Shannon, I saw your hand, and then we'll go to some closing words. Shannon?
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you to Sheila for sharing your story and your homeland. I was aware of your territory. I was saying this to the small group that I was in, but I never really made any connections to it. And I was actually looking up a map as you were speaking and trying to look at the lands and just see and kind of try to connect more with where you're coming from. And I'm so thankful for you sharing all that you've been through and your culture with us. And it made me to see a little bit more globally of what's going on. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Shannon, for sharing that. Thank you. And where are you speaking from?
Oh, I am from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Ah, wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Listen to you. What are some closing words or thoughts that you would love to share?
Sorry, who are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm just so excited about the connection here. You know, when you see the screen, you go, it's amazing. It's amazing. I was a bit foreign to Zooming. Of course, most of us were. But then when I got used to it, I started to love it because you could just be so connected, even through internet. And I say, wow, what a world we live in, that we don't have to get on a plane and travel far distances. And I got quite accustomed to it until you know, things started to open up. And so now as I you know, reach this grand age this year of 69, I'm finding traveling is a little bit tougher. As it I'm not as energetic as I used to be, and have the stamina. But it's been wonderful, and I'm really, again, just very honored and pleased to be able to connect with all of you who are from every walks of life and wherever you are in the United States and beyond. And Barbados and other places. So I'm just really thrilled that we can come together on these kind of common ground and learn from one another, and be able to try to think about what kind of world are we trying to think about for our children and grandchildren, and really, again, once again, humanize these issues. And one of the things that I'm starting to look at now and build more of my thoughts through, you know, silence and meditation is the next book on conscious leadership that I'm working on, because I think it's an important piece for us to explore how we can move forward with conscious leadership. I find since I left elected leadership back in 2005, I've been at this independently for a long time, that it's a very paralyzing place to be in oftentimes when you're in those political arenas. And having gone to those COP meetings, you know, several times in the past, it's just been very paralyzing to think that people go often, the politicians often go to these places and spaces in the mindset of trying to protect status quo. So there's no creative energy, there's no new innovative energy, and there's no sense of bonding with one another that happens in those spaces. And so I don't miss that part of that work that I did, although I think I was quite fairly effective for those 11 years in dealing with issues that matter to me and matter to the Arctic and to the people. So I think, you know, we have to be creative. And as I say, there's lots of good things happening in the Arctic in the creative world with our younger generation that are really starting to make their mark. And keep an eye on that Oscar nomination from Greenland if you can, and see where that goes. And there are other films being made now that are going to be eventually, I think, on Netflix. So it's a great time. And conscious leadership, you know, just a quick reminder at the end here, because I'm, you know, Elizabeth Lesser, who is the co-founder of Omega Institute in the state of New York, you know, is a remarkable leader in her own right, but a very quiet and calm and reflective woman. And she says, wise conscious leadership knows the difference between strength and force. And strength comes from a deep inner confidence, from loving and respecting and expressing one's own authentic self. And force comes from a deep inner wound and spawns the urge to dominate and even the score. And so we see so much of that going on in the world today. You know, we see that war happening from that place and space. And I think we need to shift the way in which we do things personally, and the way in which we treat our children and our community and our families, and ultimately that projected out differently onto the world. So thank you for listening to me today, and that we are all in this together, and we've got this. We've got this, and this is part of the solution that you are bringing me into your realm and the work that you do. So thank you for, I honor the light in each and one of you, and I thank you for honoring mine. So nakamik to all of you.
Sorry about that. Sheila, thank you so much. We're just a couple of minutes past our time. Suzanne, I did see your question in the chat. We're going to put some information on the session page. Logan, I wonder if you can put on the chat what was the thought or question that you wanted to share, while I just do some brief announcements before we go on. Please remember to take a look at the conference agenda at the Attendee Hub. We have a very varied range of activities for you to join. We have 2 exciting art sessions. One is today at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and another one is tomorrow. For the one that we have today, bring paper and pencil. We're going to have some fun. And tomorrow, join us to share poetry and short stories about social transformation and restorative experience. That's going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. There's a link to a form that Keith is going to help us to put in the chat if you wish to read something at tomorrow's session. It's going to be poetry, short stories. We ask that all the pieces run no longer than 3 minutes, and the order of presenters will be determined when we join the session itself to be inclusive of all interested parties. And enjoy the conference. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you in our next panel, and take care. Thank you so much for being here.